story today is going to be about the myth of mermaids. And once again, it's going to take us far into the past and throughout the world. So I hope you find it interesting, relaxing. It's now time to put your headsets on and maybe close your eyes to let me guide you through this journey to the world of legends. You may know that the existence of legends and myth about aquatic creatures, half woman, half fish, is not only something very ancient, it is also present in many cultures all around the world, sometimes cultures that were not in contact for centuries, and to such an extent that until the 19th century, the scientific consensus scholars believed that mermaids actually existed, even though very little observations were recorded, but they were sometimes in the 18th century included into zoology books or listings of actual sea creatures. There were many tales of sailors who said they had seen mermaids when at sea, and because mermaids were associated with the Greek Sirens, I'm going to tell you about this in a minute. The name Sirenian was given to various aquatic mammals that probably are the real origin of these observations by sailors. The sirens from Greek mythology are probably the most famous ancestors or creatures associated with the mermaids. And actually in English there are two different words, but in many other languages the same word, siren, is used for these Greek mythologic creatures and for mermaids as we know them today with their fish tail. In Greek mythology, the sirens were attractive but monstrous creatures represented either with a woman body or a half woman, half bird aspect, and they were extremely dangerous. The most famous depiction of sirens is probably in the Odysseus, the story of Ulysses trying to go back home after the War of Troy, but he has lost his way and needs to face many tests before he finds his way back. And one of these tests is the meeting with sirens as his boat is approaching the rocks where they live, because the sirens were living near the shores. They had an enchanting voice, a very attractive song, and they used it to make sailors run aground so that they could take their treasures and eat them. But Ulysses knew about the danger. He was a very clever, smart character, and before the boat approached the rocks, he plugged the ears of his crew with wax so that they would not be able to hear the song of the sirens, and he asked his crew to chain him to the mast so that even if he heard the song of the sirens, he wouldn't be able to jump into the sea, and he would be able to go through this test. He also asked his crew not to remove the chains, whatever he would say, as they would pass near the rocks. And thanks to this, even though he was able to hear the song of the sirens, he made it through this test and was able to continue his journey. But even before the Greeks, there were already in ancient Mesopotamia, in Assyria in particular. I told you about Mesopotamia and Assyria in the video about the history of Babylon. I will put the link in the description. About 1000 years before Christ, there was already a story about a goddess who fell in love with a shepherd, a mortal, but she killed him accidentally and was so ashamed and sad with the accident that she decided to jump into a lake and to become a simple fish. But she was so beautiful that the waters rejected the transformation, and she became a half woman, half fish creature, maybe the oldest trace, the oldest legend, including a siren, that we know of. When the Greeks, centuries later, learned about this story, some of them even imagined that maybe human beings could be the descendants of sea creatures that would have changed and started to walk on the land. Actually, the discoveries in biology and science in general tell us that things have been a bit more complex than that. But there is something true in a sense, because it's very likely that life and the first elaborate forms of life appeared in the sea, in the oceans, before they started to breathe air and walk on the surface of the earth. Sirens and mermaids from the antiquity until the 19th century generally had a very bad reputation. Since the publication of The Little Mermaid, the tale by Hans Christian Andersen, he was a very famous, one of the most famous authors of fairy tales in Europe. And if you go to Copenhagen, you may have seen the statue of the Little Mermaid, which is one of the most famous symbols of Copenhagen. In The Little Mermaid, with this story of a mermaid that dreams of walking on the land and living with the prince she has fallen in love with, Andersen presents a very human, very positive image of mermaids. But before him, they were most of the time associated with disasters that they announced or caused. They were generally presented as monsters. It's obviously very difficult to analyze the legends, to say what unconscious mechanism might explain the myth. But interestingly, all of these mermaids stories were invented or told this character of the mermaid as an attractive monster, the ambivalence of the relation of men with women, the fear, maybe, that behind the attractiveness there may be sin, maybe evil, maybe a danger, and actually in various Christian countries where there is very much this perception of the ambivalence of women, legends about mermaids were particularly famous and popular. I say ambivalence because in the Christian tradition, women can be, on the one hand, pure beings, mothers, the one who give life, including to Jesus Christ. But on the other hand, women are also responsible for the original sin, the fall from paradise because of Eve. And the mermaid may, in a sense, represent this ambivalence to incarnate it in a quite misogynist way, actually, being at the same time an attractive woman and also a monster with this animal part, like the Minotaur, for example. I also told you about that in the video about the myth of Labyrinth, and I will put the link at the bottom as well. And I'm telling you about this Christian tradition because after the antiquity, it is in Europe, in newly Christianized Europe in the Middle Age, that legends about mermaids or female aquatic creatures became very popular again, and maybe more popular than ever. They were often represented on churches, on chapels. For example, in the 11th century, there is a chapel built in England where one of the oldest depiction of a mermaid appears. There were many local legends in the British Isles about mermaids, sometimes not only as sea creatures, but also beings living in the rivers or in freshwater lakes. Just to name a few, there was the legend of Liban in Ireland, who was initially not a mermaid, but a human being who had been cursed and turned into a mermaid. But later on, when Christianity came to Ireland, she was finally baptized, the legend says, and recognized as a human being. There is also a mermaid in Scottish folklore called the sea ask, and in continental Europe, especially in France and Germany, a famous mermaid-like creature in folklore is Melusine. She is generally depicted with the lower body of a serpent or two fish tails, and she is said to be the cursed daughter of a prince or a king. It depends on the legends, but in the Middle Age and in the Renaissance, various families, especially a family called the Lusignan, coming from the French region of Poitou, said or claimed that she was one of their ancestors. In Eastern Europe and Russia, there is also a negative image associated with mermaids in folklore, and these creatures are often called rusalkas in the east of Europe. Here, the tradition is a bit different. They are supposed to be the ghosts, the spirits of young women who died violently and generally by drowning, and who did not go to paradise but stayed attached to the waters to haunt the livings. But the mermaids are not just an European tradition, even though we don't really know if the European tales were exported to other parts of the world, or if they are genuine local stories, because sometimes they appeared after the first contacts with the Europeans. But there are also mermaids in Asia, in China, for example. There's a story from the 15th century telling about a mermaid whose tears became pearl after she had cried. And also in 1001 Nights, once again, you will find a link to the related video in the description. There are sea creatures, female creatures, that strongly remind of mermaids, and in the Thai and Cambodian folklore too, there are stories of mermaids. And to finish this little tour of the world, there are also water spirits in Africa called mamiwata. They can be men or women, but their characteristics strongly remind of the mermaid, and this belief in mamiwata was also exported by the slaves to the Caribbean, to South America, so that mermaid legends are present on every continent. Now with these legends that spread all around the world, and these stories of actual seeing of mermaids by sailors, there has always been the question of whether they are just legendary creatures, or if they might actually exist, and the legends would only be the product of actual observations. Scientifically, it's very difficult to believe that these creatures could live in the seas. No specimen was ever found and observed by scientists, and it's also very difficult to believe that a creature that is half human could spend all its time in the sea. The human skin is not made to stay in the water more than a few hours or a couple of days. Maintaining the body temperature would be extremely difficult, almost impossible with this anatomy. And actually the sea creatures, and even the ones who look the most like humans from far, the Sirenians, have a very different kind of body with no limbs and a more aerodynamic anatomy. But there were many hoaxes with mermaids, since the 19th century, there were various so-called mermaid bodies, sometimes made of the remains of fishes and monkeys, that were exported from Asia to Europe in the 19th century to meet the demand for exotism, legends, and the search for new species. But even though all of this is not very credible, starting in the 19th century, the mermaid became a very popular theme in painting, sculpture, novels. It also inspired the writing of music sometimes. Many statues of mermaids appeared all around the world. The most famous is probably the Little Mermaid in Copenhagen, but now there are plenty of ports all around the world where statues of mermaids have been designed and installed in public space. And in pop culture, the 20th century, especially in movies, started to show and use mermaids, including in comedy. I think the movie called Splash was made in the 80s, probably, or more recently, mermaids appeared in Pirates of the Caribbean. And like mythology in the antiquity, like legends from the Middle Age, this continues to keep mermaids, or the myth of mermaids, very alive and popular. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. There are going to be versions in French and Spanish